as mentioned, I'm Nico Larco. I'm from the University of Oregon, for the Urban Next Center, where we look at the impacts of these types of things, shared mobility, self-driving cars, and e-commerce on cities. We're less interested in these technologies. What we're really interested in is the impact it has on that thing in the bottom. How does that affect cities? And we developed the Urbanism Next framework, which you can find at urbanismnext.org, which tries to understand how it is that these technologies are affecting things like land use, urban design, building design, transportation, real estate, and then the real question, how those things impact equity, health, the environment, and the economy. Those are the things that we really want to get to. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about where we are in some of these things, and then think about how they're affecting today and how it looks like we're going to be affecting things in the future with these technologies. So just a kind of grounding where we are right now. So last year, Uber did 7.6 billion trips in 2022. That's a big number. It's also not, when you compare how many trips there are, it's not that many, but you think about 12 years ago, they were at 0, right? That is a ton of growth that we're seeing. Scooters, in their first year, right, when they landed in Santa Monica in 2018, 38 million rides. That was more rides than happened in bike share over 10 years, right? So in their first year. And then post-pandemic, we hit 62.5 million rides in 2021. We're still waiting for the 2022 numbers. So these things are happening quickly. AVs, level 4 automation, that's cars that don't have somebody in them. I rode in one twice in San Francisco a couple months ago. Wow, it exists. Is it completely safe? I don't know yet. Is it great for our cities? I don't know, but the thing is out there. And you know, GM Cruise and Waymo are talking about deploying in a number of different cities in the next year, 2 years, something like that. So our question is, with all these things, what are the impacts going to be in cities? E-commerce is another thing we look at. Huge growth in e-commerce. We saw this enormous spike with the pandemic. We went from 10% to 16% of all retail. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's it, it's done. And it actually came down after that spike, but now it's starting to trend up again, right? So we're almost like continuing that same line that we had. So 15% of our retail is happening through e-commerce right now. What does that mean? Well, a whole lot of delivery of goods. So 21 billion with a B, e-commerce packages delivered in the US in 2021. It's really hard to get numbers for the number of packages. 165 packages per household. That is one delivered every other day to every single house in the United States. Yeah, think about the impacts of these things. We've also had this thing called the pandemic, which has had all sorts of changes, right? But on the one hand, huge growth in kind of bike infrastructure, reclaiming public space. But the long-term impacts of that we're still feeling those things. On the one hand, the amount of trips that are happening continue to be really high. So we're actually above pre-pandemic levels in the number of trips that are happening every day. The thing is, those are not commute trips. Those are trips that are happening every day, right? We still have, depending on who you talk to, somewhere between 30 and 45% of people working from home for a good part of the week, right? So we're changing where it is we're spending our time. And we all know that it has had a horrible impact on transit. Painful, right? 63% of pre-pandemic levels. I think cities all over the country are feeling these impacts. So the moral here is change is happening now. And the question that we're asking is, and what does that mean for cities, right? How is it that we as urban designers, as people who work on cities, who live in cities, who help shape cities, what does that mean for us? Well, I'm going to go through a couple examples of things that are impacting and will impact. We'll start with some good news. Parking, right? How much of you have you screamed into the night about parking, right? It's like controls so much of the things that we do. Well, the good news is that if some of these transportation modes that we're talking about take off, the shared mobility modes, there could be a substantial decrease in the amount of parking that we need, right? Depending on what models you look at and depending on the scale of deployment, it could be 80, 90% of parking reduction. You call the car, it comes, it takes you, and then it does something else. So huge reduction in parking, which we know, I think there's 6 billion, spaces in the United States for parking, right? Some crazy amounts of parking that we got here. Well, if we don't have that anymore, we can do wonderful things like getting rid of all that parking that's in front of our buildings and pulling our buildings all the way to the street, urban design-wise, I think we can all agree that is a great win. Fantastic opportunities for housing, right? The cost that we bear to provide parking goes away, so we can both provide more housing and provide more affordable housing. This is true in urban areas, but also true in suburban areas. So the office park kind of complex model that we have, we don't need that much parking anymore, right? So we can densify these pieces. And as I mentioned, affordability is a huge impact, right? Because we no longer have to carry the cost of the parking. Now, this is going to look different in different places, and I'll say again, it depends a ton on the business models end of these autonomous vehicle companies. We work a lot with Waymo and with GM Cruise, but it also will depend a whole lot in what areas. So this is downtown Portland, and there's some parking in downtown Portland, but not a ton. So if you say we need less parking, that's not going to have a huge impact. But you go out to the suburbs, and there's a whole lot more parking, right? And so as we think about we don't need that much, what are the impacts that we're going to have? What are the spatial impacts we're going to have in these areas? And both of those were in Portland, which still has a pretty good development pressures. This is Cleveland, right, which does not have as much development pressure happening. What happens when you all of a sudden increase the supply of available land for development in a place which doesn't have a ton of demand for development, right? If you increase the supply without changing demand, what happens to prices? They go down, right? So we could think about what might happen to property values as this stuff takes off, right? We could see drops in property values in areas that have a lot of parking right now. Another potential impact, this one not so great. So in the US, the average commute is something around 26, 27 minutes in each direction. With an AV future, if that arrives, you could say, well, maybe I don't want to spend 2 hours, but maybe I'll be willing to do 35 minutes or 40 minutes in moving, because I can now use my time more efficiently. I don't need to be like gripping the wheel and looking at the road and cursing at the people next to me. So that could have enormous pressures on sprawl. If all I want is to go to somewhere that has more green, right, or somewhere that has more affordable housing, well, you just head out a little further, right? And so this will facilitate that. So the impact this could have, AVs could have on metropolitan footprint could be painful. And we all know that sprawl has all sorts of problems with it, right? There's the cost of creating the infrastructure and maintaining the infrastructure. Ask any mayor how they feel about dealing with the cost of maintaining their streets right now, right? Painful. Well, even more of that. Land consumption and natural habitat consumption will continue to be a problem. The cost of providing services gets much more difficult, definitely fire, police, these types of things, but also social services, right? The suburbanization of poverty is a real difficult issue to address. And then if what I was talking about before with parking, the increased supply of land, well, this is yet another scale of increased supply of land. If we expand the metropolitan footprint, we've now included all that land which can be part of the city. And so what's going to happen to prices, right? They will drop more. In terms of e-commerce, the trend that we have been seeing for years is continuing, right? Which is that these large big box stores are going out of business. You're seeing pressures all over the place of people shifting to electronic buying. And so therefore, we're seeing these types of scenes, right, in a lot of our cities where this is not only this is on the one hand is a development opportunity. It's also blight. It's also kind of kills the energy and vitality of an area. And we're also seeing a ton more of this. So this is warehousing, lots more warehousing. Amazon loves the 1 hour delivery. It costs them a lot of money to do 1 hour delivery. It's really inefficient. But guess what? We all buy more when we think we can get it in less time. So that for them, that's a benefit, which means we're getting these things all over our neighborhoods, right? A couple of years ago, Amazon put in 1,000 warehouses in neighborhoods, like where we all live, like not in the industrial areas, but within neighborhoods, to be able to do this 1 hour kind of delivery thing. So it's really changing the morphology of cities. With a pandemic, we all have seen the shift from, and we're going to talk about it more later, the sessions this afternoon, but the shift from the central cities, especially cities that do not have a lot of housing, shifting to neighborhood centers being important, which this trend was already kind of happening before the pandemic, but this is just accelerating that trend. So really big question for us, how do we capitalize on this to create these places, these semi-urban places in what's typically been the outskirts of cities. I think a huge opportunity for us in that. Street design. This is a study we did a couple years ago looking at all the different ways that a street might change based on what's happening with these. Some of these things we're seeing today in real time. Some of these things, I think we're still going to have to wait a while. And I'll say again, I mean, this is a mantra. We work a lot in this kind of future, what's it going to be? There's a huge caveat with all this, which is what are the business models that exist for these types of services, right? If it turns out that these things are only for the wealthy and the deployment's going to be limited or geographically limited, it's really expensive to have these things in the suburbs or in rural areas, that's going to be really different to see the impacts we're going to have. So anyways, just quickly kind of going through some of these things. One of the great things that could be happening is that we don't need all that parking in front of the street anymore, or in front of the building on the parcel, off-street parking, right? So buildings can now actually move once again onto the street. Fantastic for all the work that we do. We could eliminate a lot of the on-street parking, right? And start using these things for other uses. The session we just saw during lunch, where you're reprogramming these spaces, fantastic opportunity for those types of things. This is a really big one. Pickup and drop-off areas. This is an enormous question. Right now that usually is happening in the, like someone double parking and letting people in and out. If we really go to scale that most people or many people are using these services, how do you deal with curbside management? How do you figure out where pickup and drop-off happens? What do you do at 5:30 when everyone's getting out of the office? For the people who are still going to the office, who all want rides at a similar time, right? How do we manage that curb space? With e-commerce happening, delivery lockers become much more important. We're already seeing some of this. Amazon's been testing a lot of different versions of this, but on-street lockers and also lockers within buildings, having that be part of the entire system. This is a really big issue right now. This is thinking about mobility hubs, thinking about how it is that micro-mobility, so scooters and e-bikes, where do they charge? We did a super interesting series of webinars at Urbanism Next with people who are actually implementing mobility hubs. And my great shock was that all of them said the biggest issue that they're having, it's an enormous headache, is how do they get electrification to work? Like how do they get electricity to the mobility hub? And then how do they meter for it? Which I had no idea that was like one of their big issues, but that was the biggest headache that they were having in making mobility hubs work, right? Something we're gonna have to think about. And then just the space that takes. Right? There's problems with clutter. We've heard this a lot all over the place. And there's also problems just for the amount of room that it takes. Right? So is it organized? And then how much space it's taking up at really contested sidewalks. This slide's kind of meant to show how all these trends are really putting a lot of pressure on streets. On the one hand, we have the micromobility where all this stuff is landing, the space it takes up. On the other hand, that is an Uber going in my bike lane. Totally frustrating, right? But that happens a whole lot if we don't have physical separation. That is a separated bikeway, but it's only painted. And then the streets as staging areas, especially as we see more and more e-commerce happening. Another one, you're going to hear a little bit more about this from Arlene, but drones is a big question. There's aerial drones and terrestrial drones. I personally have less faith that aerial drones are going to be as big, mostly again because the business model piece of it. It is expensive to make these things happen. For moving people, the people who are, we work a lot with people who are developing these technologies, they're really hoping to get it to a point where people with six-figure salaries can start to afford this. That's not a widespread mode of transportation. But some of these terrestrial drones, I think there's more opportunities. So this is an image from Berkeley a couple years back. This is KiwiBot. I think it is. What happens when there's a lot of these things on the street? When they start to compete with people moving on the street? How does this work? A big question in all this is who has access to these things? We talked about community engagement. There's a lot of community engagement that's needed around these topics. And also this question, I'll go back to, what are the business models? What makes economic sense for these things? How do we make sure that it's not just providing opportunities for people who already have a lot of opportunities? And this is the question of, do you have access to the technology? And if you have access to the technology, do you know how to use it? And if you have that phone and you know how to use it, do you have a data plan, which seems to be actually the biggest barrier of those three things? Are you banked? right? A lot of these technologies actually take people being able to use credit cards. If you're unbanked, how do you plug into the system? Is it available in my area? It could be that my area is not dense enough or not wealthy enough, or some other kind of issue that says it's not coming to me. So how is it that we make sure we don't create these barriers? And then we did work with AARP and the RAND Corporation on thinking about older adults. What does the trip look like for people who might have more trouble getting into and out of a vehicle, or when they get out of the vehicle, they have trouble with orientation, right? These are all questions that we need to deal with these emerging technologies. I'll say a really important piece of all this, which warms my heart, is that an opportunity for designers is that when some of these technologies really take off and we are able to move much easier, right? Where we spend our time will not be because it's easier or hard to get to, because many things will be easier to get to. So where we spend our time might actually have a lot more to do with the quality of the place. And I think this is something that urban designers should be jumping on, right? That if we make wonderful places, it's true today, it's just going to be more true as mobility gets easier, right? So how do we capitalize on this idea as quality being a real magnet for design? So I like to say this all the time. This kind of new mobility question, right? These AVs and Ubers and scooters, they are not only transportation issues. The same way that e-commerce is not only a retail issue, right? These are going to affect all parts of our cities and a lot of the ways that we move around, a lot of the ways where we live, where we spend our time, how we use space, right? It's important for us to be tracking these things. That's more or less the root of what we do at Urbanism Next. This is the topic that's filling my head a ton right now. And for those of you who I've met today, some of you for the first time, some of you I've seen before, I've been asking you, and what are you doing with AI? I'm teaching a class right now on AI and design because I am really both dying to and terrified to figure out how this stuff is being used. I think it's a really enormous question for us. How do we leverage these technologies? But also, what might we be losing as these technologies? The whole idea of community engagement that's not in person is done. It is done. There was a community meeting that just happened in Tigard in Portland, one of the suburban cities of Portland. And at the end of the meeting, it was an in-person meeting, council meeting. At the end of the meeting, they opened it up to online comments, and they had this tirade of people who came out with super racist and xenophobic points to make, one after another after another. And the mayor who was running the session would give them 16, 17 seconds to be okay, thank you. And she said afterwards, the thing that was really bizarre is that everyone's hand raised at exactly the same moment. So we have no idea if those are real people. They were speaking, but as far as we know, they were speaking, right? We can definitely do text to voice right now. The whole idea of community engagement that's not in person, done. That, we no longer know what's real in these things. That said, there's been a lot of thinking about what's going on in AI in terms of how, or I should say, we're trying to think about what you're doing in AI, how it's impacting design. And while a lot of what's gotten a lot of attention is this first thing, this image creation, and it is pretty incredible. I don't know, how many of you have used Midjourney before? Okay, if you haven't, you're going to go home and pay the $8 subscription a month and use it because it is crazy. The things that it can do, it is really jaw-dropping crazy. And this is most of what we've been doing. Most of the firms that I talk to say this is the work that they're doing, kind of working on image creation. This is an image of someone who put in a kiosk on the Ramblas in Barcelona, right? I mean, there was 4 more words in that, and it came up with this, right? It knows a lot about the kinds of things that we're looking for. But that's just one piece. These other pieces, I think, are things that we really need to think about. And you're going to hear a little bit more about some of these from James here from Giraffe. But there's organizational aids. So if you've never used TestFit, you should take a look at that, which actually helps you organize housing tremendously quickly, crazy quickly, and it's not that bad. But most of these things are under the category of not that bad, which we are, 10 months into AI being accessible to most of us? That should give us all pause. So there's these kind of organizational ones. I think Draft I put in that category as well. There's shape consistency AIs, which you can give it a model, and it will help you come up with 40 different facade schemes, all based on text, right? More glassy, contemporary, Beaux-Arts style, right? And it's like, boom, it just makes the thing. There's starting, and I don't have a lot of faith in this yet. I've not tested it, but I'm not convinced that it's doing really well, but it exists as a endeavor. The CD creation piece. So there's something called STRAP, I think it is, STRAPP, which is testing, like creating CDs, right, from these things. And then finally, there's fantastic analysis tools, which are just starting up, which is a huge boon, right? So TestFit, for instance, and DREP, I think, does this as well. You do your building design, and it instantly gives you both the performa and an energy analysis at the same time, right? Tremendously powerful, tremendously powerful. And my students did work with TestFit this last week, and their students, they're not that great. Like, they don't know how to do like housing yet, right? They were able to put together, I mean, my students are awesome. They're the best. You should all hire University of Oregon students. They are so good. They're so good. But they don't have like years of office experience, right? But they put together these TestFit models, and within like a few minutes, we're able to do work that literally would take your offices weeks to do, right? I was telling someone before, but there is this huge de-skilling question. So for instance, they did this and they were both jaw-dropped, terrified. There's a lot of therapy that goes on in this class. And also like kind of proud of like, oh my God, look at all this information I got, right? And they were feeling like, oh, I can do these things. And one of the questions I asked, as we were riding this wave, I said, what's the typical floor-to-floor height on a residential building? And they were all like, I've got no idea. I'm like, yes, and this is part of the problem you need to be aware of, right? This thing created schemes that you all believe, and they're good. They're not bad. They're not bad housing schemes, and yet the people who are using them don't know some of the basic things that you should know when you're doing this. So thinking about what kind of skill we're losing in these types of things. Anyway, so I think this is a big conversation that we all should be having about what we're doing, thinking about what's going to be happening in 5 and 10 years, how we need to be preparing ourselves, how we make sure that we don't cut ourselves off at the knees and 10 years from now don't have anyone who can do the work that we can all do right now because the computer does it but not well enough to really do it the way that we do it, right? So these I think are all really important questions to ask. I'll say, have you guys heard of the Gartner hype cycle? So this is in the world of like emerging everything like new Silicon Valley things, this is a commonly used kind of thought, which is that we typically, like, there's a new idea and we get this first surge of like, oh my God, it can do everything. Like, this is gonna like, and make breakfast for me too. This is gonna be everything, right? And then you go into this trough of disillusionment. This is what you have here, right? Which is like, oh no, it can't. Right? It can't do anything. This thing is worthless. And then you slowly learn like, oh, it's really good on these use cases. And if I plug it in with these other things, it can help with this, right? We are definitely on the upward slope of the hype cycle right now. But I don't know if we're here and we're going to end up with it being like a lot better than we're thinking right now, or if we're like getting near the top. I personally, I think we are more down here. Like we'll over promise or over project what it can do, but I think it's going to do a lot. So it's something a caveat for us to keep in mind. We have a conference every year for Urbanism Next. This year, we're doing it in Amsterdam. So if you guys are interested, in October of 2024, so a year from now, we're going to be doing it with TU Delft and AMS and TNO over there. I invite you to look at urbanismnext.org. There's something we created called the Nexus, which is a one-stop kind of place to come learn about all these different technologies and the impacts they have on cities. And then this is completely an aside. But when I don't work on Urbanism Next topics, I work on sustainable urban design topics. And after 10 years of working on this concept of the sustainable urban design framework, we're about to publish the Sustainable Urban Design Handbook, myself and Karin Knudsen. This should be out in early 2024. It's all to the publisher right now, so we're thrilled. But it's based on this framework, which looks at these 5 outcome goals and these 4 scales we typically work at, and looks at specific urban design physical things that urban designers should be thinking around this. So it's a great design tool, great stakeholder engagement tool, and great assessment tool. You can do analysis of areas as well. Happy to talk to anyone about this as well. So with that, I'll say it is an exciting time for us to be working in this space. And / terrifying time for us to be working in this space. I feel like the great thing about having this conference and having this session is that we're able to talk about these things, think about them, and hopefully help shape the future that we're creating. Thanks so much.